What happens when a beloved comedian's personal tragedy becomes fodder for late-night television humor. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in recent talk show history, when Patton Oswalt walked off Jimmy Kimmel Live after a heated confrontation that left the audience stunned and the entertainment world buzzing. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how not to handle a grieving guest, and how one comedian's attempt to defend his late wife's memory turned into a moment that would define both their careers. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about celebrities using personal tragedies for comedy material. The tension in Studio 6A was palpable from the moment Patton Oswalt stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set. What was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance for his new comedy special had already taken an uncomfortable turn during the pre-in. When Kimmel's producers had made it clear they wanted to discuss his late wife Michelle's death, despite Oswalt's publicist specifically requesting the topic be off limits. But television waits for no one. And as the cameras rolled, Kimmel's opening monologue had already set the tone for what would become one of the most uncomfortable 12 minutes in late-night television history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredibly talented Patton Oswalt, Kimmel announced with his trademark smirk, though those who knew him well could detect something different in his demeanor tonight. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Oswalt walked out, his usual jovial expression replaced by something more guarded, more cautious. He shook Kimmel's hand with the practiced ease of someone who had done this dance hundreds of times before. But as he settled into the guest chair, the atmosphere felt charged with an undercurrent of unease. "Patton, great to have you back on the show," Kimmel began, his voice carrying that particular cadence that talk show hosts perfect over years of practice. "You look great. You really do. How are you holding up these days?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Oswalt's eyes narrowed slightly. He had been in this business long enough to recognize a setup when he heard one. "I'm doing well, Jimmy. Thanks for having me back. It's always good to be here. Now, I have to ask," Kimmel continued, leaning forward in his chair with the predatory instinct of a comedian who smelled material. "Because I know our audience is curious. And I know you've been open about this in your stand-up. How has your comedy changed since Michelle passed away? I mean, grief is such a universal experience, and you've managed to find humor in some pretty dark places." The audience fell silent. Even from the back row, you could feel the shift in energy. Oswalt's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair just a little tighter than necessary. "Well, Jimmy, I think that's something I prefer to explore in my own work on my own terms. Tonight, I was hoping we could talk about the new special, maybe some of the lighter material I've been working on." But Kimmel was nothing if not persistent. "Oh, come on, Patton. You know I'm a fan. I've seen your recent sets, and some of your best material comes from that place of pain. There's this bit you do about Michelle's medication, about how you found all those pill bottles after she died. And I have to say it's hilarious. Dark but hilarious. Tell our audience about that." The camera caught Oswalt's reaction in perfect detail. The way his face went from polite discomfort to something much harder, much more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to a lower register, the friendly comedian persona sliding away like a mask being removed. "I'm sorry, Jimmy, but I don't think that's appropriate. That bit, those personal details, they're not entertainment for a late-night audience. They're part of my grieving process, and I'd appreciate it if we could move on to something else." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual back-and-forth banter they had come to expect from Kimmel's show. This felt real, raw, and increasingly hostile. Kimmel, however, seemed to interpret Oswalt's discomfort as an opportunity rather than a warning. "Listen, I get it," Kimmel said, his tone taking on a patronizing quality that made several audience members wince. "Grief is tough, but you put this stuff out there, Patton. You make jokes about your dead wife's prescription drugs. You talk about finding her body. You've turned your tragedy into a comedy gold mine. Don't act like it's too sacred to discuss when you're literally profiting from it." The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something had gone very wrong. Oswalt stared at Kimmel for a long moment, his expression unreadable before slowly shaking his head. "I cannot believe you just said that," Oswalt said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. "You think I'm profiting from my wife's death? You think I wake up every morning grateful that the woman I loved, the mother of my daughter, died suddenly and unexpectedly, so I could have some new material?" Kimmel's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he doubled down. I'm just saying, if you're going to put it in your act, if you're going to make jokes about it, then it's fair game for discussion. That's how this works, Patton. You know that. No, Jimmy, that's not how this works at all. Oswalt's voice was getting louder now, the careful control beginning to slip. There's a difference between me processing my grief through my art and you exploiting it for your television show. There's a difference between me choosing to share something personal with an audience that came to see me specifically and you ambushing me with it on national television after I specifically asked not to discuss it. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Kimmel's house band looked uncomfortable. The audience was silent, and even the usually unflappable late-night host seemed to realize he had pushed too far. But instead of backing down, instead of acknowledging the line he had crossed, Kimmel made the decision that would define the rest of this encounter. "Come on, Patton," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Don't be so sensitive. We're all comedians here. We all mine our personal lives. For material. The only difference is some of us are honest about it." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Oswalt stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. The way someone moves when they're working very hard not to explode. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Honest about it. Jimmy, let me tell you what honest looks like. Honest is waking up every morning and still reaching for the other side of the bed, even though it's been empty for years. Honest is explaining to your 7-year-old daughter why mommy isn't coming home. Honest is finding the strength to get on stage and talk about the worst thing that ever happened to you because it's the only way you know how to process it. And maybe, just maybe, it helps someone else who's going through the same thing." He paused, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths before continuing with a precision that cut through the studio like a blade. Honest is not using someone else's tragedy as a cheap punchline for your monologue. Honest is not ambushing a guest with their most painful memories because you think it makes for good television. So don't you dare question my honesty, Jimmy. Not about this. The audience was frozen. Several people in the front row were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and looking anywhere but at the stage. Kimmel's band members were staring at their instruments, and the camera operators seemed unsure whether to keep filming or look away. But Kimmel, in a moment that would later be dissected by media critics and comedy historians alike, chose to escalate rather than de-escalate. "You know what, Patton?" Kimmel said, his voice taking on a harder edge, the pretense of friendly host finally dropping completely. "I think you're being a little hypocritical here. You want to have it both ways. You want to be able to get up on stage and talk about your dead wife, get the sympathy, get the laughs, get the standing ovations, but then when someone else brings it up, suddenly it's off limits. That's not how comedy works, and you know it." The words hit Oswalt like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions. Shock, hurt, and then something much more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But in the dead silence of the studio, every word carried with perfect clarity. "Did you just call Michelle my dead wife? Is that what you just said to me on national television?" For the first time since the interview began, Kimmel seemed to realize he might have gone too far. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but it was too late. The words were out there, captured on camera, witnessed by hundreds of people in the studio and millions more who would eventually see the footage. "I didn't mean it like that," Kimmel said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just meant that you talk about her death in your act, so it's not unreasonable to discuss it here." "No," Oswalt said, shaking his head slowly. "No, you don't get to walk that back. You called her my dead wife. Like that's her defining characteristic. Like that's all she was. Not Michelle McNamara, the brilliant writer. Not Michelle McNamara, the loving mother. Not Michelle McNamara, the woman who spent years of her life tracking down serial killers and fighting for justice for victims that everyone else had forgotten about. Just my dead wife." The studio felt like it was holding its breath. Even the usually bustling backstage area had gone quiet with producers and crew members gathering around monitors to watch the confrontation unfold. This was no longer a talk show interview. This was something much more personal, much more raw. Michelle was a person, Jimmy. She was a human being with dreams and goals and fears and hopes. She was someone who made the world a better place just by being in it. And when I talk about her in my act, when I share those stories, I'm not doing it for laughs or sympathy or standing ovations. I'm doing it because I refuse to let her be forgotten. I'm doing it because her story deserves to be told, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. Kimmel was clearly struggling now, caught between his instinct to push back and his growing awareness that he was losing this battle badly. The audience was firmly on Oswalt's side. You could feel it in the way they were leaning forward, hanging on every word. When Kimmel finally spoke, his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Look, Patton, I think we're both getting a little heated here. Maybe we should take a step back and remember that we're both comedians. We both understand that comedy comes from pain, and sometimes we have to talk about difficult things to get to the truth of them." But Oswalt wasn't having it. "Don't you dare try to make this about comedy philosophy, Jimmy. This isn't about the universal nature of humor or the relationship between pain and laughter. This is about you deciding that my grief was fair game for your entertainment despite being explicitly asked not to go there. This is about you reducing my wife to a punchline and then acting like I'm the one being unreasonable for objecting to it." The comedian's voice was rising now, the careful control finally beginning to crack. "You want to know what's really funny, Jimmy? What's really hilarious? The fact that you think you're defending comedy right now. You think you're taking some kind of principled stand about the nature of artistic expression, but you're not. You're just being cruel. You're being cruel to a guest on your show, and you're being cruel to the memory of someone who can't defend herself." Kimmel's face was flushed now, his carefully maintained television persona completely abandoned. "I'm not being cruel, Patton. I'm being honest. And if you can't handle honest questions about your own material, then maybe you shouldn't be putting that material out there in the first place." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Oswalt stared at Kimmel for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm again, but there was something underneath it that made everyone in the room lean forward. "You know what, Jimmy? You're right about one thing. I do put that material out there. I do talk about Michelle's death in my act. I talk about the night I found her. I talk about the months afterward when I could barely function. I talk about trying to explain to my daughter why mommy wasn't coming home. I talk about all of it because that's how I process trauma. That's how I survive." He stood up from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. "But here's the difference between what I do and what you're doing. When I talk about Michelle, I do it with love. I do it with respect. I do it because I want people to know who she was, not just how she died. When you talk about her, you do it because you think it's good television. You do it because you think other people's pain is entertaining." The audience was completely silent now. Even the usually restless late-night crowd had stopped moving, stopped coughing, stopped rustling in their seats. The only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of the cameras and the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Jimmy. I've been on every talk show, every podcast, every comedy stage in this country. I've talked about my personal life, my struggles, my failures, my embarrassments. I've made jokes about my divorce, my weight, my neurosis, my family. I've put it all out there because that's what comedians do. We mine our lives for material, and we share it with the world." He paused, his gaze never leaving Kimmel's face. "But there's a line, Jimmy. There's always a line, and that line is respect. When I talk about Michelle, I do it because I love her and I miss her, and I want the world to know how incredible she was. When you talk about her, you do it because you think it will get you ratings." Kimmel's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his career as a talk show host, he seemed genuinely speechless. The silence stretched out, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second, until finally Oswalt shook his head and took a step toward the edge of the stage. "You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy?" Oswalt said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire studio like a heavy blanket. "Michelle would have defended you. If someone had attacked you the way you've attacked her memory tonight, she would have been the first person to stand up and say that wasn't right. That's the kind of person she was. She believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when they didn't deserve it." The words hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for a moment, just a moment, something that might have been shame flickered across his features. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the defensive posture of someone who knew they were wrong, but couldn't bring themselves to admit it. "Patton, I think you're overreacting," Kimmel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is just a conversation between two comedians about the nature of our craft. You're making this into something it's not." Oswalt let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "A conversation. Jimmy, you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to convince me that I should be grateful for my wife's death because it gave me material. You've reduced her to a punchline and then acted like I'm the one being unreasonable for objecting. This isn't a conversation. This is you being a bully. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kimmel's face flushed red, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. I'm not a bully, Patton. I'm a comedian just like you. And sometimes comedy is uncomfortable. Sometimes we have to talk about difficult things to get to the truth. The truth? Oswalt's voice rose, the careful control finally beginning to slip. You want to know the truth, Jimmy? The truth is that I wake up every morning, and for just a split second I forget that she's gone. I reach for her side of the bed, or I start to call her name, or I hear Alice laughing in the other room, and I think I can't wait to tell Michelle about this. And then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, afraid to make any sound that might break the spell of this raw, honest moment. That's the truth, Jimmy. The truth is that every single day is a struggle. Every single day I have to make the choice to keep going, to keep living, to keep being a father to my daughter, even though the person I most want to share all of this with is gone. And when I get on stage and talk about that struggle, when I share those moments with an audience, I'm not doing it for laughs or sympathy or your ratings. I'm doing it because maybe, just maybe, there's someone else out there who's going through the same thing, and they need to know that they're not alone. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Oswalt wasn't finished. But you've turned it into entertainment, Jimmy. You've taken the worst thing that ever happened to me, and you've tried to make it into a bit for your monologue. You've taken my grief, and you've weaponized it against me. And the worst part is, you seem to think you're entitled to do it. The comedian took another step toward the edge of the stage, his body language making it clear that this interview was over, whether Kimmel wanted it to be or not. I've been in this business for 20 years, Jimmy. I've dealt with hecklers. I've dealt with bad reviews. I've dealt with bombing on stage. I've dealt with critics who didn't understand my comedy. But I have never had someone try to use my wife's death as a weapon against me. Kimmel was clearly struggling now, caught between his instinct to fight back and his growing awareness that he had lost this battle completely. The audience was firmly on Oswalt's side. You could feel it in the way they were sitting, in the way they were looking at him with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. Patton, please, Kimmel said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. That was completely at odds with his usual confident demeanor. I think we've both said some things we don't mean. Why don't we take a break, maybe start over, talk about your new special? But Oswalt was already removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. No, Jimmy, we're not starting over. We're done. This interview is over. And quite frankly, so is my respect for you as a person and as a comedian. He set the microphone down on the chair he had been sitting in. The small thud it made somehow carrying more weight than all the words that had been spoken. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy? It's not that you ambushed me with questions about Michelle. It's not even that you called her my dead wife on national television. The real tragedy is that you had a chance to do something meaningful tonight. You had a chance to have a real conversation about grief, about loss, about how we process trauma through art. Instead, you chose to exploit it for entertainment. The studio was completely silent now. Even the usually bustling backstage area had gone quiet, with producers and crew members standing frozen, unsure of what to do or say. This was uncharted territory for a late-night talk show, and everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. I'm going to leave now, Jimmy Oswalt said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. And I'm going to go home to my daughter, and I'm going to try to explain to her why Daddy was upset on television tonight. And you know what I'm going to tell her? I'm going to tell her that sometimes people say hurtful things, and sometimes they don't realize how much damage they're doing. And sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away. He turned toward the exit, then paused and looked back at Kimmel one last time. I hope you're proud of yourself, Jimmy. I hope this was worth it. I hope the ratings are good because they came at the cost of your integrity and my respect. With that, Patton Oswalt walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a stunned audience, a speechless host, and one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Kimmel's stunned expression and the absolute silence of the studio before finally cutting to commercial. The confrontation lasted less than 15 minutes, but it would be talked about for years to come. It was a masterclass in how personal boundaries should be respected, even in the world of entertainment, and a stark reminder that behind every comedian's joke is a real person with real feelings and real pain. So, what do you think? Was Jimmy Kimmel out of line for pushing those boundaries? Or was Patton Oswalt being too sensitive about his own material? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from the world of entertainment.